It's I cringe on saying it's finally here, but it's here. I know that the guys, the players, the coaches are all super excited to get started on Friday. Been waiting for this moment for a while. Looks like the weather's going to clear up and should have 3 really good days of baseball. I know the fans are excited as well. We're on the cusp of breaking another season ticket record, which is always good, and one of the biggest reasons that, when people talk about the atmosphere at Swayze Field, they talk about it being one of the best in the country, and certainly, opening up with, number 1 Louisville, doesn't hurt, and should make for a great weekend, for college baseball, not only here in Oxford, but certainly a lot of people that'll be following around the country. Trying to, before we, talk about the players individually and the positions, which I know everybody's waiting on, I was trying to think, what else, to share with you, over the last 6 months, one of the narratives, which understandably so, much has been asked about the number 2 ranked recruiting class, our recruiting class, the current freshmen and, incoming transfers. And certainly, that's understandable. Really talented crew, guys that we'll certainly are going to count on, to help us have some success on the field. Certainly another angle for you reporters have been, the 2 football guys, right? Jaron Neely and John Rice Plumlee, 2 guys that, are going to play 2 different sports, which is somewhat unusual these days, especially to be a star. Especially and both of them, were obviously stars, on the football field a few months ago, and have done well, since putting on the baseball cleats and getting out here at our field, and certainly I think you'll see them this weekend. But I think probably the biggest narrative I think that we talk about, in our coach's office and our staff is, probably how understated the returners are. As I mentioned, I get so many new faces. We have 20 new guys, only 34 players, on the roster. 20 of them are new, 16 freshmen, 4 junior college transfers. But that makes for 14 returners. And, the returners are all guys that most of them have played huge roles in the program already. Most of them have guys that are stars. Either All-Americans or preseason All-Americans and or freshman All-Americans, and guys that have already kind of staked their claim, to not only college baseball and the SEC, but, our program. Guys like Tyler Keenan and Anthony Servideo and Kevin Graham was a freshman All-American as far as position players. And then when you look at the pitchers, last year when I stood up here, almost a year ago, we had no returning weekend starter. This year we returned 2 of our weekend starters, Doug Nikhazy, and Doug was a freshman All-American, and of course Gunnar Hoagland, who pitched in the 3 slot for us last year the entire season from the start to the finish. So excited, along with Taylor Broadway and Austin Miller. And so when I think of the narrative for this team, or when people say, how are you going to be, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, is really that's what I think drives you. It's how well the returners, how well the leaders perform. And so with that, I'll go around the horn, so to speak, talk about the players, and then leave it up to you for some questions. First, we'll start with the pitchers. Friday night we'll start Doug Nikhazy. Saturday we'll start Gunnar Hoagland, and on Sunday we'll start true freshman Derek Diamond. Most of you, as I mentioned, are familiar with Gunnar and Doug. Derek, won the role, I think, just because from start to finish, from September to last weekend, he was probably the best performer. of all the guys, and had an outstanding fall, and I think he gives us the best opportunity to win, on Sundays. In the bullpen, starting off, Austin Miller, who I've mentioned, and Taylor Broadway, Greer Holston, Max Trophy, all familiar names, guys that have pitched in the program, but along with Braden Forsyth, Jackson Kimbrell, Benji Gilbert, an outstanding freshman left-handed arm, Drew McDaniel, and several others. And a lot of depth on this staff. I think, a lot of our teams in the past, once we got past maybe the fourth pitcher, there was a drop-off. And here, I think, once we get, in that 5 to 10 range, there's a lot of capable guys that, may end up, having bigger roles as the season progresses. Around the horn, as I mentioned already, the left side of the infield, Tyler Keenan at third base, Anthony Servideo. As many of the beat writers know, there's a great competition going on at second base with Peyton Chatinier and Justin Bench. At first base, another competition, but some of it just has to do with maneuvering guys from the outfield to the infield. And DH, Tim Elko, team captain, is at first base, along with Cale Baker, junior college transfer, who was the Triple Crown winner in junior college baseball last year. Behind the plate, Friday night will be Hayden Dunhurst, true freshman. Backing him up will be sophomore that was with us last year, Knox LaPasser. In the outfield is probably the most fluid situation, and I probably expect it to be that way for the first few weeks at least, and maybe even until we get into the month of March and close to conference play. We've moved Kevin Graham into the outfield. He still could see some action at first base, but Kevin, we wanted to give him an opportunity to maybe play corner outfield, much like we did with Tim Elko last year. So Kevin Graham's been out in left field along with Hayden Leatherwood, another junior college transfer. In center field, Jerry and Neely will start on Friday night in center field. Also in center field is Cade Salmons, who a true freshman from Jackson, Tennessee, who had just a tremendous fall for us, led the team in stolen bases, hit close to the mid 300s, and has played well in this early spring. Right field could be John Rice Plumley, any of the other guys that I've mentioned in the outfield to this point, and certainly either Peyton Chatinier or Justin Bench, and I think those guys may do a little bit of the Anthony Servideo, Jacob Adams move that we did last year a lot with those guys playing, some right and some second base. So with that, I'll open it up to you for questions.
Mike, with Tim's versatility, I know you like him defensively at first base, but does that help kind of solve things if you got a surplus at first base and put Tim in the corner if you need to? Okay.
Sure. Corner outfield you're talking about? Yeah, no doubt. And that's why I think it's still a little fluid, and we'll try to play a little bit of the right-left matchup. And as you know, I like to do that, especially early, to try to give some guys some the best shot to have success off the bat. And so, with Detmer, throwing on Friday night, a left-handed guy, and Miller throwing on right-handed on Saturday, gives us an opportunity to play some different guys and hopefully, get those guys off to some success. But, Tim is kind of that utility guy that can do anything. He can either play corner, he can play third base for us. I mean, I think we feel comfortable that he could play, corner outfield, corner infield, and of course at DH, I didn't mention, but Ben Van Cleve has played really well, had a really good fall, and so some options for us to maneuver some guys to get some at bats.
Mike, now that you've had this practice, your squads to look at this signing class, how do they compare to 17 a few years ago?
Wow, that's probably is all the questions. I don't know if anybody's asked that, and I don't know if I've given it a lot of thought that way. I think it'll be different on this team. It'll look different to you and a lot of people, and it's probably unfair to this class where maybe not a ton of those guys will be starting or in, there's no shortstop. There is a catcher, but there's no shortstop. But there is a center fielder and a catcher, so maybe that's the wrong way of looking at it as well. So now I'm kind of thinking as I'm talking. So I think it's talented. Again, I think it's got some high-end pitchers. You see the first weekend we got a pitcher that'll be starting out of that class. I think it's very comparable without a doubt.
What's kind of stood out about Derek Allen and that you go ahead and put the freshman in the rotation?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I think from the day that he stepped on campus, he's been the best guy for that role for us. He struggled a little bit in the last couple weeks, but it was really more we did something a little different that we normally don't do and thought we needed to do, not for Derek's sake, but I think for the offensive sake and for the pitcher's sake. We matched up, if you would, the better pitchers against a projected starting lineup the last 2 weeks. And so, ones versus ones, twos versus twos, to use the football terminology. And so a little tougher for the pitchers, to get them out. But Derek, again, I think from day one, if you look at all the outings, you don't just look at the last outing. If you look for all the outings, I think he gives us the best opportunity to win. Going to throw the fastball in the low 90s. Got a hard slider at 80 miles an hour. Great competitor. A kid that looks the part, looks confident, and that's one of the, I think, challenges for the young kids. Is are you ready for this? Not just physically, but mentally. Do you believe that you belong? And I think he believes he belongs.
Burton was really good on Sunday. Did he kind of push and make that a little more complicated?
Not necessarily for the first weekend, if that's what the question is. But certainly, I think every time somebody has success, I mean, it's noticed, and maybe more so than the opposite. Than when somebody doesn't do as well. Somebody goes over, or somebody, we all, want to gravitate to success. Somebody hits a home run in an inter-squad game, everybody notices it. But I think even more so in Wes's case because, Wes missed most of the fall. Had that freak injury where he cut his, finger up a little bit and couldn't pitch, and missed the majority of the fall. And so the fall was kind of hard to really gauge him on. He had some good outings. He had some outings that weren't as strong. So, but certainly has put him in a role of, that, he threw 5 innings as you saw, so he can get extended a little bit. Big, physical, 6'8" right-hander. But I think he also showed on last Sunday that he'll throw it in the strike zone, and so he'll be in the bullpen, that first weekend. And I didn't mention him, did I? That was a mistake. Sorry. Should have mentioned him. Handled it, fine last year, and again, the move was just give us some more opportunities. He's been okay, average, and so if you hit, that's okay, all right, but he's been good enough out there to I think play out there.
You've had some exceptional catchers through the years, and it's really unfair at this point to compare Hayden to him, but as he opens his career, do you feel like from a projection standpoint that he's got a really
Well, it's hard to project, and a lot of times when you say that, especially in these settings, it's super positive. So it's better to say just right now, I think. And right now, the best compliment is he's as good as any freshman catcher we've had right now. Meaning, your freshman year, about to start the season, and that's in all the phases. Again, when you watch games, when you're in the stands, when you're in the dugout, you notice things positively. And he showed a great arm and a great release this fall, where he threw out a lot of base runners, and I think that's probably caught most people's attention because of Cooper Johnson leaving, and that was really his forte. And people, wow, so you suddenly start to turn some heads that way. But as the fall progressed, he got better behind the plate receiving and blocking balls. I think really, I don't know if better is even the right adjective. It was probably just feeling more comfortable. And as you know, David, you've been here, all 20 years. We're hard on catchers. And, the expectations are high back there. And so it's not easy, especially when you first get here, because we can be tough on the catchers, with our expectations and what we're asking them to do, and not just as far as the coaching part of it, but all they have to learn, all the signals and all the information that goes through the catching. There's a lot put on them, and but he continued to get better throughout the fall, and not that it's a surprise. I mean, he's a high-profile kid coming in, a kid that we were had a lot of angst about. During the draft, and a guy that had to turn down a lot of money to get here, but then as the spring even gets here, he's continued to swing it really well. He hit 3 home runs, I believe, since we've been back over the last 3 weeks. So he's ready.
In the outfield competitions, we've had a handful of guys that played a lot of infield,
Mm-hmm.
whether levels or some here. How important is it to you that you guys be versatile like that?
I don't know if it's important or something that we necessarily look at, but it just kind of lends itself. And I don't know if we're the only program doing that. Heck, I got a son that is doing that in one of our competitor schools. So I just know that the middle infielders know that they can run out there and catch the ball. And gosh, you're right. We've done it with a lot of guys. Most recently with Olenek and Golsons or Video. But Kyle Watson did it for us. I mean, infielders, tend to think it's pretty easy if you don't have to catch it when it's bouncing and you don't have to throw it to a base. They think the position's pretty easy. So, and they sometimes make it look pretty easy out there.
With so many of the spots fluid right now, just what is the challenge of playing a team like Louisville for you getting to evaluate against?
Probably, yeah. I think if we would want to say, hey, these are the 3 guys. But a positive way of looking at it is, sometimes the 3 you pick aren't the right 3. So this is going to give the competition and being able to play some different guys out there. I think it's going to give them some opportunity to get some at bats and some playing time, which I think is always a good thing, especially for some new faces. And the truth is, as good as Louisville is, I'm sure they have some areas like that. And so just because it's fluid or just because you may see some different guys in there doesn't necessarily mean, this is intramurals where you're just on a whim throwing some people out there. These are guys that we think can compete, and some of it will be a right-handed, left-handed thing. Some of it's just to find out, who's going to play, who's going to be able to perform out there. It's a little different when you turn the lights on. It's a little different when you're playing somebody for real. And some guys really excel in that. Some guys don't. And so we got to find out the ones that do.
How many guys do you anticipate playing out there just opening again?
Probably at least the 6 that I mentioned. And I don't know if it's not an intramural, so it's not like it necessarily will be even, but if you were counting bodies, it probably will be 6, and if Elko runs out there, it might be 7.
Sometimes JUCO transition is as risky as freshman. You
Right.
mentioned at least 3, potentially in the lineup. You like kind of maturity of those guys that you've seen to this point?
Yeah, and again, you're exactly right. I think, a lot of times, and I'm a believer in it. I don't think you can base your whole recruiting class off of a bunch of junior college kids. It's just, the turnover rate is so quick that it's hard to, I think, sustain that. And you can have some ups and downs. And but I've always been a believer that if you need an immediate fix, if you need somebody, sometimes it's easier to get a kid that's 21 years old that's played a couple of years past high school and played some junior college baseball to come in and kind of give your program a shot in the arm in that immediate need, and so that's why you do that. And probably a good example, but hopefully he's at that hump that you're talking about is like a Cale Baker who really had a bad fall. Statistically, and really struggled, and a kid that obviously can hit and is a really good baseball player, but he's the leading hitter this spring. so in the 3 weeks that he's been out there. And he looks different. And it's amazing when you have a little success and you start to believe and have a little confidence, how different you look out on the baseball field. So that's been nice to watch.
What's been the difference with Baker? Is it adjustment he made, swing-wise, anything in particular that you've seen?
I don't think so. I mean, I'm sure if you ask him, he may have something. And as you know, Ben, that sometimes that physical adjustment lends itself to just some more confidence and feeling better. And, you know, baseball, we use terms where, hey, I'm just not feeling comfortable, or I'm not feeling it, or, you know, my rhythm. And you hear all these things that people can't really articulate what it means. And a lot of times it means that, you know, I'm just not real confident right now. And for whatever reason, you know, he struggled in the beginning, and it kind of snowballed on him, you know, throughout the fall. But you know, he looks real good right now.
How have you seen Doug and Gunnar handle their roles differently every year too?
And that's one of the neat things about being a coach and coaching college baseball players is, you know, they're at an age where they change a lot, you know, and not just physically and but emotionally and mentally and you know, to watch guys when they're freshmen become sophomores, or sophomores become juniors and leaders. And but I think both of those guys, because of their roles last year, even at a young age, you know, a lot was put on those guys. You know, people forget, you know, it's your guys' fault. You write all these stories about the freshmen, and then when come May, you stop writing that they're a freshman anymore, which I get. But the truth of the matter is they're young. And, you know, when you look at it that you're in a super regional and, you know, you got 2 freshmen, you know, pitching, you know, the last 2 games, there's a lot on those guys. Now they deserve that. But, you know, I think, you know, that'll weather you. You know, that'll strengthen you. That'll make you better. And I think we saw that in Rollison, you know, going into his sophomore year, where, you know, it wasn't easy for him his freshman year. He started off in the bullpen and became a weekend starter, but he was a different guy, you know, come his sophomore year, and felt like a leader. And I think we've seen that in Gunnar and Doug, you know, where you can, you know, they act different. You know, they are the leaders of the staff. They carry themselves with an air of confidence, and that's good. We need that.
See anything with how the two of them have, like, talked to or handled Derek, who's in a similar position to especially where Gunnar was last year?
I don't know anything specific, but, you know, Derek's here. You can, you know, talk to Derek. He may have a story for you, but I think it's good. You know, one of the things that probably, you know, as we're talking about it right now, is, you know, last year Doug didn't have that. You know, he had Will. You know, but Will was a reliever. You know, it wasn't like, you know, Rollison was there to kind of show him the ropes and to lead him. And so it's probably nice to have a couple guys that were just a freshman a year before, and, you know, were put into that weekend rotation, and how do you handle it, and the ups and downs and so on.